Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Larry Sanger, who is the co-founder of Wikipedia, a small little website that catalogs a plethora of facts about the natural and human world, and yet somehow those facts are always beholden to consensus and therefore to power. And in this conversation, Larry and I talk about the tension between truth and political power and his conversion to Christianity. Find him to be a fascinating individual. You can find links to his work down there in the description, as well as links to support this channel. Without further ado, here is Larry Sanger. I was going through your Wikipedia bio, and one of your big points of interest is the nature of expertise, and what has just been erupting across the tacosphere or the discourse is what is expertise? It seemed like from certain ways of viewing the Douglas Murray, Dave Smith, Joe Rogan conversation.
Oh,
I don't know
yeah,
if you watched that at all or seen any
a
clips.
little bit.
Murray is coming under fire for trying to gatekeep who can speak about a contentious issue in the Middle East.
Right.
And I'm wondering, how do we, if that's a topic that you're still particularly interested in, like to what degree do we rely on expertise and how is that developed over, especially on the internet? The funny thing about Wikipedia is that it began as this, online project, and then you hear all these school teachers saying you can't use that as a reference, but then it became a tool of political power and began to be the arbiter of expertise. So it went from the very people who were saying you can't rely on this, began to rely on it. And it's very interesting.
Uh-huh. Um, so that's a very good question. And I actually had I remember over 25 years ago, I think, one of the last graduate courses I took was on expertise with one of the world's greatest experts about expertise, George Pappas. He's an expert. Um, and Anyway, um, so I think that um, the very use of expertise in discourse, especially about politics, about a lot of the um, culture war stuff, um, a lot of the discourse and use of expertise is just completely off base. Um, Expertise actually has a fairly, or it used to have a fairly narrow use, right? So when you wanted to know some piece of technical information on which you could rely on um, uh, someone who would agree with other experts on the technical information, but which the ordinary person would not have, that's when you would consult an expert, right? If you wanted a quick answer, generally speaking, they can do the calculations really quickly, or they already know the answers, or whatever. You can, and it wasn't just about technical stuff. Sometimes it was about like, ancient manuscripts, for example. Wesley Huff, for example, kind of showed up, um, one of these New Age guru types, um, by using his expertise about ancient manuscripts. Um, and That, I suppose you could say, talking about Wes Huff's expertise about ancient manuscripts is meaningful and useful in this case. There are certain things that he had off the top of his head, which the ordinary person, even I, who have actually read some stuff about that, would not have off the top of my head. Um, and it really expertise in this sense, it requires generally years of training, and it's specialized training. It's not general reading. And there's a reason why someone does not become an expert simply by reading a lot of general books on a subject. Because there are people who read like books upon books about theology or about like military warcraft. Aircraft or other wonkish things, right? And they don't actually become experts on those things, despite all of their deep, or I should say, their broad knowledge on the topic. If you really want deep expert knowledge, something that really is considered expert, it requires a hard, careful study. So, in other words, expert in this original sense um, is something that is hard won. Um, so, um, uh, you know, the idea that we can't speak intelligently about history um, is just wrong. You can have perfectly, if without being an expert, I mean, um, you can have lots of deep, relevant insights into history simply based on your memory of what was going on at the time. Now, there's certain aspects of history that really do require an expert's attention. And it's also true that somebody who's simply more intelligent or has a lot more experience thinking about a general problem area, as in philosophy, for example, or any of the humanities, um, those people tend to be better at reasoning. But here's the thing: this is what's amazing to me sometimes. You know, um, there are some generalists who study, they read very widely, and they have a deep, especially training, especially in philosophy. That really helps as one of the areas, um, and they just become, all-encompassing, excellent reasoners about practically everything.
Hmm.
Like you throw a problem at them in a musicology, and if they've read several books about the subject, they actually sound like what other people would call an expert.
Hmm. Hmm.
You see? So
Yeah.
I actually tend to think that there is far, far too much um, fascination with attention to the people who are called experts when it comes to like just, you know, coming up with opinions on stuff,
Hmm.
right? But if you're actually trying to quickly get to the bottom of some hard technical questions in medicine, for example, to change the example, then yeah, you actually rely on the experts. Um, here's another thing that's actually extremely important to bear in mind, and which these people who clearly don't know anything about expertise, like Douglas Murray, um, uh, what they just get wrong, and that is if you're going to make reference to expertise in an argument or an authority, then in order for it to be valid, the experts actually have to agree, right? So if there
Like a
is broad,
consensus.
yeah, well, not just a consensus, there has to be some objective um, uh, the experts will be able to trot out their evidence, and they'll trot out the same evidence. They'll go through the same reasoning. So it isn't just a consensus, because sometimes the experts will have a what they call a consensus about things that they have no business having a consensus about, because they're basically all overconfident because they agree with each other. It happens all the time. It happens a lot in psychology, for
Hmm.
example.
Yeah.
Even happens in philosophy, where definitely we have no business being so confident of our agreements.
Yeah.
Um, and it's definitely true also in history. You have no right, basically, to impose your ideologically motivated conclusions on debate simply because you happen to have more expertise than the other guy that you're debating with. Um, it's a fallacy, you know.
Yeah.
So
So trusting wholly in expertise is insufficient. But we do, as human animals, and maybe it's because we want a shorthand for somebody to trust. We need to trust somebody, so we arguments to or appeals to authority, they work on us because we rely on authority on some level.
Yep.
But when it comes to bias, it's really, really difficult to strain bias, whether you're an expert or a non-expert on any given situation, especially when it comes to a political
Hmm.
matter or issue.
Right. Well, so I'm sorry, I didn't really understand the question.
Oh, it
So,
wasn't really a question. I'm just sussing out the
oh,
field of inquiry about expertise, trust, and bias.
yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, it is a misuse of the appeal to expertise or the appeal to authority, um, to pretend that a question is a question on which um, uh, the appeal is valid, when basically what I'm trying to say is, if you pretend that there's a consensus in the field, or if you can pretend that there's an objective fact that all the experts agree on, um, uh, and there isn't one, then the appeal to expertise is very much fallacious.
Yeah.
Uh, so, right. I mean, and that happens all the time. It's a terrible problem as far as I'm concerned. In fact, I was just looking at some videos yesterday by this a Bible scholar. You'll probably know who I'm talking about. He's a Bible scholar who is actually a Mormon. And he's really heavily into the historical critical method, and he's got an extremely arrogant demeanor. Now he's got several degrees. He's got like uh, I don't know, a couple of master's degrees and at least one PhD. So he's like highly qualified as far as that goes. Um, but he makes these very confident pronouncements that I'm not as much of an expert as he is on these matters, but I've done enough reading. I've done quite a bit of reading in the last 5 years about, theology and philosophy of religion, etc. Um, and I know that he is simply repeating the, well, let's just call it the academic consensus, the secular academic consensus on a topic. When, as I said before, you know, you can't advert to a consensus where there is no business um, and talking about a consensus at all,
Mm-hmm.
right? If people are really actually debating the issue and from radically different points of view, the fact that you and your friends all agree, and are no longer debating it means nothing,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
I happen to think that there's a lot of things that virtually all scientists or all researchers or whatever have believed in the past and have turned out to be false. Happens all the time. And we have a fairly good idea, I think, not a perfect idea, but we have a fairly good idea about how to characterize the things about which you can advert to a an expert opinion. Um, these are matters, and validly, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
they are all describable as matters of fact.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, and that can't mean just something on which there is no disagreement. It has to, that the notion of a fact has to be reduced to not just agreement, but something having to do with machine calculability and um, careful observation, something
Okay.
like that.
Yeah. So dentistry, certain levels of medicine, right?
Sure.
But when it comes down to a current ongoing conflict in the Middle East or any other conflict, or let's say the Ukraine Russia conflict,
Yeah.
like something that's immediate, that's happening right now, that's involving millions of people, well, multiple millions of people, and hundreds of years of history. Something like that is not so easy to suss out what the matter of fact is, but
Yeah.
because it's an ongoing conflict, we have to make a decision, and it's arguable whether or not one has to make a decision. But when it's a matter of war, and you're looking at destruction and death, then we
Mhm.
need to make an immediate conclusion in order to solve this problem, even if we don't have access to all the facts.
Right.
So
Right.
that
Right.
puts us in a very immediate kind of situation.
Yeah. And there's such a thing as an expert opinion, and expert the opinions of people who know a lot about a general subject area, because like they've spent a lot of time in the Middle East. They know the language very well. Um, Maybe they grew up in the area. Maybe they've read a whole lot of books, or they've done some archaeological digs or whatever. Um, the opinions of such people, when there isn't agreement, are still inherently more interesting, I would say,
Mm-hmm.
um, because they're better informed. They won't commit beginner mistakes, and that actually is like that's pretty important. It's important to save time. So if you there's a reason why we do trot out experts in a um, in a discussion, uh, like that firing line, for example, or meet the press, whatever. Um, these programs where different sides are pitted against each other. Um, um, there's a reason why it's important to have reasonably expert people on such programs, is that they simply won't commit the sorts of blunders that total ignoramuses will naturally commit.
Mm-hmm.
That actually is one of the main reasons why it's worthwhile to spend a lot of time off of social media and in edited publications, taking in edited publications of one sort or another. So,
So a lot of your work in the world has been around merging the internet to the encyclopedia, or trying to formulate an encyclopedic domain of the internet. What are some of the things that you've learned over time about the nature, like if those two things work together, where they don't work together, like trying to make a base of knowledge that is humanly accessible and then humanly editable? What were some of the things that you guys, you and your co-founders of Wikipedia and all the other projects that you were involved in, had no idea what you're getting into and had to learn over the years and over trial and error?
oh, that's a good question. I don't know that anyone has ever asked it quite like that before. So I would say uh, one thing that we didn't understand adequately, although we could have guessed it, um, was that uh, when you get people together to collaborate on text, um, they are ultimately not going to, many of them are not going to be able to set aside their biases. Um, so you can articulate a neutrality policy for Wikipedia, and that's a good thing, I think.
Yeah.
Um, but and you can like hold people to the policy, but you can't somehow make people be themselves neutral. They won't. And the way that you solve problems conflicts in a collaboration um, cannot uh, rely on people simply coming to an agreement. This is one thing that I've learned very well, but Wikipedia still hasn't. Sort of institutionally, they have this institutional fiction of problem solving by consensus. So they actually still talk about the idea of deciding the hard questions on the encyclopedia by consensus, which is absolutely ridiculous. There is no consensus about most of these things. We can go into details there, but there's a lot of other
Hmm.
things, I suppose, that we've
Why
learned.
would they gravitate towards consensus then? Is that just
Well, there's a
efficiency?
historical reason for that. Um, Basically, when Wikipedia got started, um, it was half in the encyclopedia world and half in the wiki web world.
Okay.
So now the original wiki was called wiki web,
Okay.
and also called the Portland Pattern Repository. So it was a database sort of uh, a collaborative database of programming patterns apparently.
Okay.
Um, and there was this whole, I don't know, lore body of practice that had risen up over the previous 5 years, maybe 6 years, quite a while actually. It's like one of the first sorts of websites that actually arose, the wiki, um, and Wikipedia was definitely not the first. And so there was this distinction in the original wikis between document mode and what did they call it? Not conversation mode, um,
Commentary or discussion or
discussion mode. That's it. That's it. Discussion mode and document mode. So
okay.
all pages would begin in discussion mode and people would just sort of talk back and forth, um, and essentially try to document whatever the topic was at the top of the page. Maybe somebody would say a few words about, distinguishing what was meant. But for the most part, people are just giving their opinions. And then somebody, when things seem to be settling down to when the issue had been fully explored,
Yeah.
then they would go back and incorporate all the different comments in a single document. And then the page would be in document mode. Now, the process of doing this, there was an aim at what they called in those original wikis consensus. So there was an attempt to aim at a consensus. And the idea was, and it worked pretty well actually, for most wikis, but that's probably because people didn't care that much in
Yeah.
many cases, right? Because it's like programming and it's like, okay, you believe this about that. Well, why don't you go and start your own page? Okay, fine, I'll just do that. And it was more of a set of essays that people, were crafting together. And if you didn't like somebody's approach, you're free to make another one.
Yeah.
Um,
So like
and
forum like or kind of Reddit-ish kind of threads that were then summarized by
sort of,
somebody.
yeah,
Yeah.
a little bit, right. Um, and so when Wikipedia got started, um, we actually fairly early on, within the first 6 months, I think the first 3 months, we had decided to not use this um, discussion mode and document mode. I mean, the first several weeks, I think people who had come from the wiki world, the pre-existing wiki world, not Wikipedia world, because that just started, Um, they were like trying to use this discussion mode and document. There were a few people like that. And eventually we said, you know what, let's just like have a separate page altogether. So we actually used a sub page as it's called, but now it's in
Hmm.
a different namespace. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But the point is that the discussion was simply separated from the beginning from the document.
Yeah. So
Um,
there's the document was first and foremost, and that's what most people read when they came to the page, and the
yeah,
discussion
um,
was addended to it.
had actually been hidden from the users, and it still is, of course. Um, and It used to be in the first several years of Wikipedia that you could find all kinds of really interesting discussion going on, just like a Reddit forum, indeed, on the talk page. That is not really so much anymore.
Yeah.
Now, the talk page has changed. I don't need to get into that, but the point is that there really was, for the first several years, a good faith attempt
Yeah.
to uh, achieve what could be described as a consensus. So people were in a sort of friendly, collegial fashion going back and forth and saying, well, I don't really like that wording. Let's try this other wording, and that will like take care of some of your concerns and also take care of some of my concerns.
Hmm.
That's not how it works anymore at all.
No.
Now
Okay.
it's just like they more or less try. I mean, if it doesn't matter or if people are just wired that way, they will just naturally do it that way. But a lot of people who work a lot on Wikipedia, they just want to lay down the law and they want it to speak with their voice. They want the article to speak with their voice. And then they call that the consensus. They
Okay.
just
Yeah.
bless
Of
it
course.
as the
Yeah.
consensus because it goes through the process because everything has been made into a process.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting process
Yeah.
and
But
authority.
there's this cargo cult idea of the consensus. You can't have a consensus about things like communism and capitalism or about religions or whatever. There's people will certainly disagree. And I don't just mean that they disagree about doctrines and about ideologies. I mean they disagree about um, how to characterize them, and not even that. They disagree on the very project of representing everyone's views sympathetically and fairly. Some
Hmm.
people just absolutely reject the idea of neutrality, even if they're like willing to say, sure, okay, yeah, I'm neutral. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I think Wikipedia is just a fascinating example of how prestige corrupts knowledge or
Mhm.
the pursuit of knowledge. So when Wikipedia was not didn't claim to be an authority and was never treated as an authority, it could actually have authority with regards to accuracy. But once it accumulated a certain amount of prestige, where it became the source of knowledge or the database, then it attracts people who are concerned more with power and the the trappings of authority rather than accuracy. I think that's
It
a
actually
fascinating.
it attracts people who are powerful, um, who have money, who are willing to pay the people who have are concerned about power and who then are willing to basically be their hired guns on the
Yeah,
platform. I
yeah.
know that has happened. In fact, there's a lot of people will tell you that well, that's what they do for a living, essentially. Um,
Hmm.
so, basically Wikipedia PR firms. They are paid editors. Um, Not all of them will say that they're paid editors. In fact, many of them will not, but some of them will.
Hmm.
And yes, you can find PR firms where, basically if you want to solve a problem on Wikipedia, then you
A
can.
reputational issue or something like that.
So it's the way you formulated it right at the beginning, I thought was really useful. How did you put it at the beginning of when you were just talking about this topic? How um I think it's in your notes because I saw you reading there. Um,
Well, I just the nature of authority and how, like, the New York Times, because it is the New York Times, is the
right.
trusted news source, not because it's the trusted news source. And
Yes.
once Wikipedia became crossed a barrier from being sectioned off from power because nobody cared about it,
Yeah.
it was safe to be accurate. I'm sorry, I'm always in the moment, so I always forget what I
Right,
just
right, right.
said.
Yeah. Anyway, that's actually it's very astute, I would say,
Hmm.
that there is a real problem about uh, a real difficulty in finding the truth out about anything that matters, um, if it is associated with power.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
that is certainly got to be the case. I think this is one of the reasons why we feel like we don't really know what's going on in medicine or in pharmaceuticals. It's like, there's a lot of money to be made there. There's a lot of policy that is affected. You know, if you can just cause people to like die off more quickly by withholding certain drugs, for example, or
Hmm.
treatments, or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, or yeah, if there's like certain genetic manipulation you can do, via chemicals, that sort of stuff is it's going to be hidden, in and it's knowledge, and it's actually might be important for people to know to fight against it.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it will be hidden from the general public because it's powerful. Um, well, like the old saying says, knowledge is power,
Hmm.
and
Power corrupts.
it's not just knowledge about drugs though and things like that. Obviously, um, you know, uh, what we think we know, or what we are portrayed as knowing, or what the leaders of society say we know, um, are capable of determining policy and determining how we educate children,
Hmm.
and many other things like that. Um, so,
The so if we know that human beings are, you said some are wired to be unbiased. Some people are wired to be neutral, perhaps, and
uh,
most people aren't.
at least to be easier to work with, so that
Oh,
you
okay. Yeah,
so they're able to negotiate.
yeah.
Uh, yes.
I, with regard to like understanding reality, we're whether we like it or not, we're really reliant. Especially the younger you are, the more reliant you are, generally speaking, on the internet for your reality, and that not only your social connection, but what is a fact. I'm going to look it up. I'm going to Google it. Now, with the and at a certain point, and we're reaching the end of this point. At a certain point, the internet was mostly human beings, and now it's mostly internet. Because with the introduction of AI, which is built specifically to mimic us and to be better at mimicking us than we are in certain respects. What is your thought on trustworthiness, our connection with reality when AI is introduced to solve the problem of bias, perhaps?
That's not going to solve the problem of bias, that's for damn sure. No question about that.
Well, maybe of inaccuracy then? So we can get the facts because AI can articulate the facts for us because it has more knowledge and more reasoning capability.
All of the things that I said before are not changed. In other words, there are yes, there are certain issues about which, um, there are facts. So um,
Hmm.
Okay, I'll give you a good example. Um, Wes Huff can tell you off the top of his head that Codex Sinaiticus um, has, you know, is missing certain parts. Um, and those are objective facts. He knows them off the top of his head, and that's can be very useful. And AI can do it faster than Wes probably, or in the future it will. Um, maybe there's actually aspects uh, of
Recall.
expertise that cannot be. They don't actually emerge from our from what the AI would use for training data. Okay,
Hmm.
so there's certain making certain kinds of estimates, um, or it just wouldn't appear in the training data. And
Okay.
so anyway, but that aside, um, if Wes Huff were to say, well, these are the earliest and best manuscripts, as you will read in the footnotes of many of your modern Bible editions, um, that's a matter of opinion. Lots of scholars disagree with that. Maybe not the majority, but a lot.
Hmm.
Um, and it's a judgment. Now, how would using an AI make that any less problematic? It wouldn't. Um, and in fact, what an AI, what an LLM is trying to do is, as you say, to approximate what humans would say. So
Yeah.
it's basically an average of the training data, essentially. Um, Now there's certain sort of subroutines that you can tack on that will make certain improvements. You can give it access to some coding or to dictionaries and so forth, and then it in the same way that the human brain is compartmentalized and different parts of the brain are responsible for different sorts of functions. So a well-constructed future LLM will have lots and lots of different uh, other functions like that. It still doesn't matter. That's still not going to solve this problem.
Hmm.
That there isn't. Well, let's just put it this way. There isn't anything about LLMs per se that uh, make them such that we can rely on them to give us an objective truth where experts could not give us an objective truth, if you see what I'm saying. Um, the
Hmm.
difficulty frequently comes down to um, uh, wild, wildly divergent um, background assumptions, essentially, which
Hmm.
um, are reflected by the training data, but are not but they're not evident to the LLM, I suppose. In the future, I suppose they might be, but that still won't solve the problem. In other words, I'm kind of getting into the weeds here, I suppose, but an LLM of the future will actually know, well, I know that I am saying that the Codex Sinaiticus is um, considered to be the oldest and best manuscript because I believe the following things, and it
Hmm.
just and it sort of has self-knowledge of its
Priors. Yeah.
the reasons for its background, um, its background knowledge that goes into its judgments. That's not going to obviate the necessity of having any background assumptions at all. In other words, having massive amounts, having the entire library beautifully processed in a single LLM is not going to somehow um, change the fact that when we make judgments about things, we are relying on fundamental, irreconcilable um, assumptions that we
Hmm.
make, irreconcilable with other people's assumptions.
Hmm.
So, I
So
mean,
I, what
oh,
I'm
sorry.
gathering is that there are domains where certainty can be very nearly attained, and those having to do with the material world and certain forms of biology and certain types of rudimentary philosophy, just like the basic arithmetic and just basic fallacies, and just like those things can be accurately relied on. Like we can
Yeah.
rely on these things.
If it can be observed, tabulated, calculated, then people will be willing, under all but the weirdest sorts of circumstances, to agree with each other. And that sort of agreement will not change over time. It will
Okay.
not be subject to the vagaries of doctrine and politics and whatever.
Yeah. I guess so there are domains where we can be certain, or where a consensus or an agreement will persist over time, but there's a lot of domains where that's just not the case, and we should not assume that to be the case. And so I think one of the fundamental aspects of growing wise on the internet is to know when trust is an issue and when it's not, when expertise is necessarily an issue and when it's not, when there are other things at play where we can't necessarily rely on a definitive expertise. And
Yeah,
once we gain that, then we can tread more correctly.
there's actually two different issues here. It's not just trust, um, but whether uh, trust is the uh,
Like the
even
currency.
relevant,
Yeah.
right? So if I know that Wes Huff has, a degree from some institution, that he's like, written some books or papers, and like has a ginormous collection of manuscripts and whatever, um, then uh, I can trust him on his what he claims are facts about his area of expertise. Their trust actually makes sense, right? But if he starts opining about conclusions that he draws from that those facts, and
Mm.
other things, then um, I mean, someone who just like doesn't want to think very hard about it could say that, well, I just trust his opinion because, I think he's been right about most other things. That's a different kind of trust. There,
Mm-hmm.
you're basically letting somebody else do your thinking for you. Um, and the in the one case, in the first case, what you're trusting the person to do is to give you the facts that somebody else, anybody else who had the information or who had the data right in front of his eyes, um, would tell you. In the second case, um, then you're just trusting his judgment, trusting his wisdom, something
Mm-hmm.
like that. You're using that person's intelligence in place of your own. Um, but
Mm-hmm.
there is no sense of trust that is really meaningful, um, there, in the way that it is in the first case, because there are no objective facts in the same way, or at least agreed upon facts. Now, we could trust God about the about opinions, what human beings would call opinions. So if God says, "Thou shalt not kill," um, then we can trust God in that sense. Um, but it's simply a different matter altogether if you're not dealing with someone who isn't omniscient. you
Yeah, I
know,
guess that's the ultimate appeal to authority. God says.
right?
Why don't we kill?
He
God
made
says.
it so, so
That brings up another line of inquiry I wanted to suss out with you. Why have you gotten so into theology, philosophy, or religion? What's the attraction for that, and what have you? How does that map onto your work around knowledge and internet databases and stuff like that? Was that an outgrowth of the pursuit of knowledge? Love
not
you, or
really.
is it a
I
prompt
mean, it
from
certainly
somewhere?
has a relationship now, I suppose. Um, but I mean, you could say that, yeah, I guess it does have one connection, which is a personal connection, but common with many other people. Namely, I have a strong interest in the truth, generally speaking. Um, Again, many people do, and I came to believe at a certain time in 2020 that the Bible is the inspired word of God. That basically, um, if you read the things that the Bible says, you are actually reading things that the Creator of the universe asserts to be true.
Hmm.
At least you can glean that. Not everything that is asserted by the Bible is actually true, because the Bible doesn't actually mean to assert everything that is in it. Um,
Hmm.
sometimes it quotes the Satan, for example. Um, but at any rate, you see what I'm saying. Um, so everything that the Bible claims to be true, um, or implies to be true, is true on my uh, view. And if it actually is from the creator of the universe, if that's correct, then that means that, I mean, what more important source of knowledge could there possibly be? None at all. At least we can stand here.
Hmm.
Um, so that's definitely a big part of it.
What
Um,
happened in 2020 that convinced you of that truth? How were you argued into trusting that authority?
well, I mean, I can tell you the story. I don't know how far back you want to go. But yeah, I was an agnostic for over 35 years. Um, I but that wasn't because I thought that knowledge was impossible. I got a PhD in philosophy in order to, essentially, well, learn what the philosophers think is really important and true. Um, and not because I particularly wanted to get a job in the area.
Hmm.
Ultimately, it came down to, is it going to, um, well, in the earliest days, actually, I thought I was going to write a big system of philosophy, just like the old philosophers did. Um,
Hmm.
Not sure I'll ever do that now, but at any rate, the that was sort of like the goal. Um, because I thought that there's basically nothing more important than to the know the truth about the deepest things, essentially. Um, so, but I thought there weren't any really good reasons to believe that God exists. Um, and then,
Just this is a rudimentary question, but I think it's overlooked because we just assume. Why would that question even be relevant, whether or not God exists? Why is that even?
it's one of the if it's true, then it's one of the most fundamental features of the universe. Like I said, I wanted to know all the truth that really mattered, especially that mattered to living um, well,
Okay.
to having a good life. And and certainly if God exists, then that radically changes how you think about the good life. Um, it's not just moral uh, conclusions that are changed.
Hmm.
Um, so many other things, metaphysics, epistemology, etc.,
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
are affected to one degree or another.
And some people at that age, college age, can't accept the position of being an agnostic. Some people have to believe or have to not believe. That's why we have believers and atheists, and then the agnostics. So, what's the particular, in your estimation, what's the particular quality or characteristic of an agnostic?
Well, the way that it's explained by analytic philosophers. So if you take uh, an introduction to philosophy class, one of the units probably will be on the existence of God, and they will make the following distinction in your class. Um, a theist is someone who believes that God exists. An atheist is someone who believes that God does not exist. And an agnostic is someone who neither believes that God exists nor does not believe that God exists. An agnostic merely withholds the proposition.
Okay.
Um, Now, the original notion, which some people still insist on, but well, ironically, I suppose, philosophers, not philosophers, um, the original notion of an agnostic was that we cannot know whether God exists, which is
Okay.
a different claim. All right.
Well, that's a claim that you can know enough to say you can't.
I suppose,
Yeah.
right. We can actually take that position.
Yeah.
Uh, mhm.
I just wanted to pause on that characteristic, being able to withhold a proposition. If that's what you said, to be able to
Uh-huh.
accept ambiguity. That's a characteristic. That's a characteristic of somebody, and that is a position in and of itself, if not a conclusion, but the ability to not have a conclusion about something.
Sure.
There's probably cultural reasons why you would want to answer whether or not God exists, but there's also personal reasons whether or not God exists, or to embark upon that question. And I just wondered, for you at that age, you were able to rest in the ambiguity, or were not compelled to say he does or he doesn't, or you can or cannot know that God
Mhm.
exists. So it didn't matter to you, I guess, at that point. It wasn't.
Oh, no, no, no. I think it mattered. It's just that having the truth, having certainty, was more important than than accepting something that I might think is probably true.
Okay.
So I made an effort to withhold um, judgment on things that were less than certain.
Okay.
I mean, this is often uh, considered the scientific approach to scientific questions, right? So you don't come to a firm conclusion until like all the evidence is in, and you never come to an absolutely firm conclusion ever because, well, there's always possible evidence that might appear.
Yeah.
Um, so it's something like that, but with regard to basically all difficult knowledge. Now, fairly soon, I ended up um, being in the camp of the Scottish School of Common Sense, as it's called, um, the which was started by a Scottish Enlightenment philosopher named Thomas Reid, R-E-I-D, who
Hmm.
I really recommend. He came after Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, and also after Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. Um, and just before Kant, he was actually, I think, a contemporary with both the later Hume and the earlier Kant. Um, and he uh, he held that we can have knowledge of those things which are, as it were, built into the human equipment, which we cannot help but believe. In other words,
Hmm.
there are certain things that that we believe due to our essentially human nature, um, and we can pretend to disbelieve them. We can go through a sort of charade in doubting them, but we don't actually doubt them. So this is sometimes an accusation that's made of external world skeptics, like they leave their skepticism behind when they leave their studies and walk down the stairs.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so um,
You see that a lot in a lot of domains, but a lot of people who appeal to expertise or to their own expertise or to their own unbias or to the unbias of their preferred system leave that unbias behind on all these other domains. It's constant. It's a source of great. I'll have to come up with a particular example, but it's a source of great entertainment to me that people who proclaim their ability to be above it all are completely blind, intentionally so, to where they're not. You know.
in fact, one of Reed's principles, or earmarks of common sense, as he called them, um, was if uh, if it makes sense to laugh at someone for believing something, um, then it's more likely to be a principle of common sense.
Hmm.
If it's
Hmm.
absurd, if it's
Yeah.
if the denial is truly absurd, um, and so he didn't, for example, make an attempt to argue against the external world skeptic who says you might be dreaming, this, even it doesn't matter how vivid everything is and whether you can remember the day up until this point and so forth and so on. None of that matters. You might be dreaming, and therefore you can't really know that the things that you seem to see in front of you are actually there. It might just be a dream. Um, or for that matter, you might be, in the modern version, you might be in a computer simulation, and so the things
Yeah.
you see around you are not actually real, and so forth. Um,
And that doesn't really matter because
And what Reed said about such doubts is that we can simply take for granted that what we seem to perceive under ordinary circumstances is actually the case. Um, Now, this does not mean that we can never be wrong. So he was willing to admit that we have or that our knowledge is not. Um,
infallible.
Certain
Yeah.
necessarily infallible. That doesn't matter. You can still take it for granted. So he also rejected to that extent um, the Cartesian quest for absolute, clear, and distinct perception certainty.
Hmm. How does that fit into your development, your spiritual development?
Well,
This common
so
sense.
I was willing to stand there, right, on the principles of common sense, but it didn't get me very far.
Hmm.
Um, and you know, I was willing to take positions, but they were always, um, let's just say they were always um, provisional, and um, I didn't think it was necessary to take any sort of provisional stance on matters of religion. And the arguments for the existence of God are just not very good in this. That's what I said. And I still think that individually, if the conclusion is that God exists, individually, the arguments are not very good. That's just a
Hmm.
fact.
Hmm.
Okay.
Is
Uh,
that because of some essential nature to the question that argumentation is not the proper way to reach the
it's
conclusion?
that if you're making a rigorous case, for example, um, for the conclusion that unnecessary being exists, Um, you can get up to that point of the argument and you have made the rigorous case, but and that conclusion might follow reasonably well. Okay. But you can't get from that penultimate conclusion to the ultimate conclusion that God exists without a whole bunch of other reasoning,
Yeah.
right? And you know, this is not a thing that natural theologians that philosophers of religion are unaware of or anything like that. They're
Hmm.
very aware of this, um, whether you believe or not. And in fact, it's interesting. William Lane Craig did a review uh, of my story, my conversion story, which is on larrysanger.blog,
Okay.
um, beginning of March. It's very long, and it went viral. Um, and so he did a review of it over a period of, a couple of sessions, and in the first session especially, he was responding to, my old views on these sorts of things, and so yeah, his take on this sort of methodological skepticism was that, well, it's just an irrational approach. It's better to have um, a lot of truth that might be wrong than to have only certain truth that can't be wrong.
Okay.
Um, I think I agree with that actually to some extent, although I think sometimes um, it does not matter that much. Um, and I think the uh, whether you take a firm stance on things about which there are not clear answers. In the case of the existence of God, um, well, Craig actually had a, a different um, response. He responded to a different part of my testimony. Um, he said, "Well, what we understand that the conclusions of each of the arguments are relatively limited if you really want to be strict about it. Um, but in all of my debates, he said, I ultimately fall back on or use a cumulative case. So the idea is you put all the arguments together
Hmm.
and um, they fill in the gaps of each other. So one argument will tell you that it's a necessary being. Another argument will tell you it's the cause of the universe. Um, Another argument will tell you that it must be mind-like because the universe features of the universe need a designer,
Hmm.
etc. Um, and when you get down to the bottom of it, natural theology, in other words, the kind of thought about God that is doesn't make use of the Bible. Um, Natural theology is able to conclude that God exists. Um, Now, I I never took that sort of approach seriously until I started reading the Bible and uh, thinking the traditional arguments for the existence of God, um, thinking about them again for the first time in some years, which I started to do in 2019, I guess. Um, so as it happens, maybe maybe um, Craig didn't get to this part of the testimony, but that actually is the thing that persuaded me. In other words, it is in fact um, amazing how much more likely it is that God exists if you put all the arguments together. One thing that I found myself doing as I was reading the Bible is saying, well, look, I'm just going to be honest with myself. No, I don't actually think the argument from contingency establishes that God exists. But there's a certain version of the argument that really does make it more likely than not that a necessary being exists. And that actually gets you pretty far. It's what is the nature of this necessary being, especially a necessary being that explains the contingent facts in the space-time continuum we see around us.
Hmm. Does so you're speaking about, I guess, the theological aspect of the religious life and how people argue back and forth and how the mind cogitates whether or not or that God exists or that God doesn't exist. But I've never seen anybody actually, and this is contentious, actually filled with the Spirit of God based on argument. People can use those arguments; they're efficacious to a certain degree, but that doesn't contain the reality of what follows from a conclusion. I don't even know if it's necessary to believe that God exists or to have all those arguments stacked up to be godlike or to be like a child of God, maybe.
I see.
Whatever is the
Are,
more preferred
are you
language.
are you saying simply that you don't think it's necessary to be able to give a philosophical defense of the existence of God in order to believe that God exists? Because I
I Yeah, I don't know to what degree it really matters, and there's always
no,
like
I see.
a testimony can. That's why you called it a testimony when I was thinking of it as a testimony. A testimony isn't an argument. It's not a dissertation. A testimony is a historical story. It's something that somebody lived through, and
Right.
through a bunch of contingent facts or contingent experiences, they come to a conclusion. And that conclusion doesn't stop at being believing in God doesn't stop. That's
Yeah.
the beginning of a certain process, and actually that's a point away. That's a point along a certain process, which I would consider a spiritual life. So, if you agree with that, even if you don't agree with that, we can talk about it. But if you agree with that, like what convinced you
Mhm.
enough to be convinced, and to what degree does like what is around your life that
Yeah.
made it matter?
Right. So it was several different things. Um, uh, in the previous 20 or 30 years, um, one by one, different uh, barriers, um, bricks in the wall between myself and God, so to speak, were removed.
Hmm.
Um, so um, so I think of my my initial skepticism or methodological skepticism threw up a wall uh, between myself and all sorts of beliefs back
Hmm.
when I was about 16 years old. Um, and I started removing some of the higher bricks, you might say, earlier in my life. Um, but the ones that were keeping me away from God stayed pretty high. But every so often, a different reason not to believe would come down.
Hmm.
I won't go into the details there because there's a lot of those details. Um, but at a certain point, I hadn't actually met God. Um, but I was ready to, I guess you could
Hmm.
say. I wasn't opposed to the idea. The only thing that really stopped me was I had not been convinced. Um,
Hmm.
and moreover, I was still methodologically hostile to the idea of making up my mind. if you see what I'm saying. I still didn't want to make up my mind about such things. Didn't think it was
Yeah.
necessary.
Was that because of the value of being non-biased, which is really important in your other realms of life?
Well, not non-biased, being rational, being 100% rational in what I believe, I think is
Hmm.
which is different from being non-biased or unbiased. Okay, so anyway, uh, I started reading the Bible um, again for reasons I won't go into um, in December of 2019, and when I started doing that, I I thought that it was important for me to understand the Bible as the Christians understand it, because um, I'll fill in a little bit of the backstory here. Um, I was concerned, um, had some evidence about this. I was concerned that uh, the people like Epstein and other people who committed some horrific acts with children um, um, were basically occultists, and that occultism um,
Hmm.
is a direct inversion, perversion of um, a lot of Christian doctrine and symbology and Jewish. Um,
Hmm.
and I thought that if I were to really understand their point of view and what's going on and why they're willing to undertake these bizarre risks to themselves and so forth, um, I thought I should actually acquaint myself with the Bible finally, which is something I always wanted to do. I wasn't
Hmm.
like opposed to knowing about the Bible. I just thought, well, there's probably nothing really very important to know about. So, I mean, I was willing to rest with the level of ignorance that I had. I'd read several books of the Bible several times. That was enough, basically. Um, but no, when I actually started reading the Bible in December of 2019 for good understanding, trying to get all of my questions answered, um, I I was kind of shocked in some consternation that uh, that there were some fairly good answers to the questions that I was asking. Now, I'm not saying that I believed the answers, like I had lost my marbles or something like that, no longer thinking critically about these
Yeah.
things. No, it's that what was surprising to me was just how in what detail and with what precision um, uh, theologians had actually thought these things through. Like all of the questions that I had asked, they had thought through multiple different possible answers, some of them more likely than others, given like the hypothesis that God exists and so forth.
Hmm. Hmm.
And the thing that was amazing to me is that it was possible to defend not just the existence of God, but the inspiration of the Bible um, on uh, against the sorts of doubts that I'd had, and even more. And that had been going on for 2,000 years. It's called theology.
Yeah.
Um, and no, I mean, of course, I knew that there was such a field, and I had a reasonably good idea. I'd taught philosophy of religion before. I wasn't totally ignorant of it or anything, but I had never really had this perspective on it. It's like, no, these people are actually trying to make the Bible rational. And they're not like taking the first answer on face value, which is what I would have expected.
Hmm.
They are actually trying to think these things through like rational people do. So theology is what rational people do when they are coming to grips with the Bible and trying to make it make sense to rational people. And
Without like post hoc rationalization. But
well, that's just the thing. I know what a rationalization is like. These were not rationalizations. A rationalization generally is something that um, can be understood as such against a background of assumptions that you already make. So a rationalization sort of carries within it the very notion of a rationalization carries within it the notion of cognitive dissonance, right? If you're merely rationalizing something, then you're going to find yourself in disagreement with yourself on
mm,
some really fundamental issues. And what I was coming to realize is these people don't have cognitive dissonance. They
mm,
actually are be able to justify their beliefs all the way down.
mm,
It actually makes sense, rationally speaking.
mm,
And then you put that together with the arguments that I was coming to. I said it at bottom. I actually think that there does need to be an explanation of the order that we see around us and the universe. And I don't just mean, you know, um, you know, I'm not talking about a God of the gaps argument against uh, evolutionary theory. No, the evolutionary theory itself exhibits a certain kind of order, if it's true.
mm,
Um, and there needs to be an explanation. Where did that come from?
mm.
Um, didn't just it wasn't just an accident, I guess.
Yeah.
The sort of beautiful, extremely rational order that we see around us in the universe is not just an accident. Um, that's a very, very loose summary of a very complex, string of arguments. I ended up
Yeah.
starting to write a book called God Exists, which I'm still working on, in as I was undergoing this conversion process. And actually, it's been fairly important my in my conversion.
Yeah. I
So,
find it fascinating that what prompted your spiritual journey, or this part of it, was seeking answers for human wickedness. Some people are prompted to go to the Bible when they're seeking consolation, like a tragedy happens to them personally, and they're broken in some way, or broken by life in some way. But what you brought up was you're trying to understand wickedness, like why, like you see the devil, and that leads you to God's kind of, to really
yeah,
simplify it in a way.
yes. I was simply trying to understand what occultists are reacting to. Um, and
Did you
I
find the answers about that, or what did you find to
Oh
answer
yeah,
that?
I think so. I think I've learned a lot more about that. I understand a lot more about like Gnosticism, for example, and what they are reacting to, why they are so hostile to to the Bible. It's very important, actually, especially today. Um, and
Could you expound on that? I'd like to understand it myself.
increasingly today, a lot of a lot of people are willing to concede that a God exists, or that there is something beyond um, the fleshly world, space-time continuum that surrounds us. Um, but increasingly, also, they're willing to explore um, things in the West. I mean, other than Christianity. Um, So, uh, so they're willing to say, for example, sure, I believe that God exists, but it might not be, the God of the Bible. Not really quite sure what it is, what she is, or whatever, that
Hmm.
sort of thing. Um, and then they essentially make it up as they go along. That's how it looks like from a um, somebody who is merely exploring. But the history of this stuff um, is very ancient. Goes back before Christ. Um, the Pythagoreans actually are one of the main sources of what later became Gnosticism. And according to the Gnostic view, this world that we see around us is actually evil. It isn't good.
Hmm.
You know, at the end of Genesis
We're
chapter
trapped
1.
in a simulation kind of thing.
Well, some people like to call it that, right? But you don't have to like make it into a
Yeah.
technological thesis. Back then, they simply said that this is just a grand deception, or simply a lower level of existence in which we are all trapped. And then the idea is the creator is actually evil. He's called the demiurge, um, and uh, and it's often part of the gospel of such people, of the twisted gospel. It's not a gospel at all. Um, is that Jesus was actually fighting against, reacting to this evil demiurge, trying to lead people toward the light. So that's one of the words which is very biblical and very holy,
Hmm.
but which is inverted, is twisted into its exact opposite. In this case, into what the Bible would call darkness. Um,
Why would people? What affords? What are they afforded when they believe that?
what are they? What?
Afforded? What does that allow them to do, or what does that
Yeah.
justify about their life, or how does that shape them,
Well,
their
it's
behavior?
interesting. It's first of all, it it makes more sense of like their reaction to the Old Testament. So a lot of people will read the Old Testament and say God was a bully. God was telling people to go wipe out whole peoples,
Hmm.
dropping the context that, of course, those people that God was instructing the Israelites to wipe out were um, the worst of the worst. Um, and the when the as I like to put it, when the children of such tribes were killed, uh, it's hard to say, but they were they were being done a mercy, um,
Hmm.
because they had no chance at all of emerging as anything but unrepentant sinners, and the worst kind, themselves murderers and child rapists and so forth, as their parents were. Um, so that's what we're being asked to believe. Um, but there's a certain kind of person who like is willing and eager, in fact, to just put all that aside and said, well, it's still really and obviously unjust, and therefore anyone who ordered the chosen people to do that would have to be evil. Um, and again, and then they'll say things like um, the serpent was actually the good guy, the serpent in the garden,
Hmm.
um, because he tried to um, illuminate, bring knowledge to man, when in fact what it was is knowledge of evil. Right? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil was the thing that was wrong with it was the evil part. It's not the good part.
Hmm.
So it was what
What does
what they,
knowledge mean in this instance? It's not like a Wikipedia
I
entry.
no, I don't think
Yeah.
so. He was God was not like forbidding knowledge of ethics. He wasn't like saying it's bad to know ethics. It has nothing to do with it. Um, what it really ultimately meant was, um, are you going to acquaint yourself with the evil of which you are capable by disobeying? It did not matter. There's no totemic value of the fruit that was of the tree. That didn't matter. That was just a symbol.
Yeah.
All that mattered was it was an act of defiance of God. And in doing that, they were violating their own innocence. Before that, they were like innocent children. Um, they did not have um, every virtue, right? They were not morally perfect in that sense, but they were sinless. They had done nothing wrong, and
Well,
they were
from your
pure.
point of view, is it possible to be wise without acquainting oneself with the knowledge, with the evil that one is capable of? Like, is it necessary for man to fall in order for wisdom to exist in the world?
Perhaps, perhaps. Um, let's just put it this way. I think God allowed um, the serpent into the garden, and he put that tree in the garden. He's responsible for both of those
And
things
he
being
created the ability, the arm that reached and the
free
mouth
will.
that tasted. Yeah, free will.
Yes. Well, I mean, and the thing is, it is ultimately going to be to God's much greater glory. It is going to create a much more glorious creation if we are participants in our own righteousness, basically. If we are,
Mm,
in other words, if we are simply robots who have no choice about what we do, then we're simply extensions of either God or of something that God has created.
hmm
You see.
hmm
Um, Whereas if we have free will, um, then we can be participants. Um, and free will, all free will is the ability to rationally deliberate and be responsible for choice. Um, so the things that remove free will are the things um, that impede the possibility of deliberation. Like when you get drunk, for example, you become less free in that way, although you
mm,
freely get drunk in the first place, so you
yeah.
still bear the consequences. But and the same goes for like when you're taking drugs, for example. But the point is that ultimately, the thing in virtue of which we are free is our ability to rationally deliberate about our actions. And what that means is we can choose to follow certain principles or not. We can anticipate in the future what's going to happen based on our knowledge of certain principles and anticipated outcomes and so forth. And then it's up to us to decide whether we're going to embrace certain uh, patterns of behavior or not. So God had to create free will in order for there to be glorious new levels of order in the universe. Otherwise,
Hmm.
it was all just going to be mechanistic. Um,
Clockwork. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. How did uh, how did how did this transform you? The being convinced of God's existence. How did what chain reaction did that cause, or what series of
Uh,
effects
well,
tacked onto that?
it took a while. I mean, the most immediate consequence was I was just reading the Bible all the time for several months on end. Um, and then, um, but my relationships changed. I think I became kinder to my family. Not that I was like a total jerk before that, but I think I'm less of one now anyway. And and other people too, I suppose. Um,
Why?
not a saint.
Why would that follow? Explain it like I'm five.
Yeah,
Why would
yeah.
you be nicer?
Uh, well, uh, well, if I'm going to explain it like you're five, I'll say, well, I know the God's watching.
Okay.
And not just that, but
Yeah.
God is like a beloved father who I don't want to disappoint. That's maybe more important. Um, if you have faith in God, if you trust in God, that doesn't just mean that you believe that He exists. You know, even the devils know that God exists and they tremble, said James.
hmm
Um, but No, what it means is that you are loyal to him. You trust in him as you do your father, and you love him. In fact, if you don't love God, you're not really loyal to him. And if you love someone who is your creator, then naturally you want to please him. So I
Hmm.
think that that has a lot to do with it. I also do believe in the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. I think that the um, the Holy Spirit makes us aware. It puts our conscience on steroids, so to speak. Um,
Yeah.
it makes us feel our sin more keenly. And more than that, it
Yeah.
actually motivates us in ways not possible before um, to to run away from it. Um, I found it possible um, uh, to practice certain kinds of self-discipline that I was not able to before,
Hmm.
you know, and there's a
Yeah.
reason for that,
Yeah.
The indwelling of the Holy Spirit is my explanation of that. So,
So how is that transformed to go to make a full circle? How is your religious conversion or transformation or the process thereof? Because I believe it's a very long process. It takes thousands and thousands of years. If we do have eternal soul, the journey doesn't just end when you die. But that's another question. But how has that transformed your relationship the to what we're talking about with regard to the internet or technology where it is right now, and knowledge and truth and expertise, and how we communicate reality and and use the internet to better our relationship with reality? Have you gained any insight about that through your religious process?
um, I'm not really, I'm not sure I have very much that's deep to say on that. Um, I would say that I thought that some of the things that I'd been doing all my life were probably um, approved by God.
Hmm.
Sharing knowledge is generally a good thing. Um, I thought it became more important to me to uh, make up backup copies of the great books of Western civilization. I don't want them to be lost.
Hmm.
I want them to continue to be widely available to everyone. So they need to be available in many, many copies in many different places as proof against tyranny, essentially, in the future.
Hmm.
Um, I think, and you know, the accumulated theological wisdom of Christendom is important to preserve. That's not the only thing. I mean, education generally is a great blessing on humanity,
Hmm.
secular education uh, to a great extent. And Shakespeare and chemistry and art history, the rest of it. It's all good,
Hmm.
um, to a great extent anyway, except when it's not. Anyway, um, but beyond that, I'm not really sure that it's like given me a deep new insights. I would also say that I use my social media accounts for evangelism now.
Hmm.
I tweet more than half of my tweets now are about some Christian theme. Not always. Sometimes I go through periods. So
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have a particular bugbear or worry about what's happening currently? Like, what are you most worried about? You mentioned tyranny, so I'm wondering where tyranny is lurking right now and where you would have people be more aware of it, whether internally, psychologically, spiritually, or externally, politically, worldly.
Yeah. Um, well, I think I mean your way of asking the question is a little confusing because when I think of tyranny, I mostly just think of um, political tyrants,
Mm-hmm.
and they're kind of stretching my brain here to when you ask
Well,
about other types of
yeah,
tyranny.
if we just focus on political tyranny,
Uh-huh.
both sides in the United States accuse the other side of being tyrants or
I agree with
projecting a lot of fear around tyranny. So, from your own particular point of view, where is the tyranny lurking, and what do you take up arms against?
Well, it's a couple of different things. Um, I think that human beings, that the right sort of life for a human being. Well, actually, let's begin at the beginning here. Um, the most important thing for political systems to respect is human life. Let's begin there because there are some who seem to not believe that, or they act like they don't. Um, and this requires one way in which my politics has changed is um, I now feel like I much better understand the pacifists, um,
Hmm.
like the old Mennonite, uh, Quaker, Anabaptist strand in um, the Reformation kind of appeals to me a little bit in that in its pacifism. Um, but so any sort of ideology that makes too many excuses um, for war now bothers me.
Hmm.
Um, Now, I'm not saying there's no such thing as a just war. I do think there is such, I still think there's such a thing as a just war, so I'm not that much of a pacifist. Um, but I do think that there are very powerful, influential people who have gotten rich by funding both sides of a war, of probably many wars. Um, and they are not friends of humanity. They're it's a win-win for them. They're getting rid of the little people, and they're getting really rich in the process. Um, so they would be some of the enemy as far as I'm concerned. But then I think that proper human life, as I was about to start saying, is one in which we are responsible for ourselves. Um, we are not cogs in a machine being told what to do, um, and we are left alone. Um, we're able to pursue our projects, um, to take care of ourselves and our families in the way that we would like to, as long as, of course, it's within the bounds of natural law, essentially. Um, then, and having said those first two things, that pretty much puts me in one camp as far as I'm concerned.
Hmm.
Um, and it isn't necessarily like the Republican camp. It's these days it's an anti-establishment camp,
Yeah.
right? So I'm a lot more allied to or allied with old-fashioned liberals
Hmm.
like my dad, who
Hmm.
still votes Democrat. Well, maybe he doesn't vote Democrat anymore. I'm not sure, actually. He's 88 years old. Um, I don't know how he voted in the last election. Um, but Yeah, he's an old liberal, and he believes in the little guy. I do believe in the little guy more than I used to. I used to be much more of a hardcore um, libertarian, and now
Hmm.
I have fewer problems with the welfare state.
Hmm.
A little fewer. I actually think that it's there's it can be defended, and it doesn't bother me so much as long as it doesn't end up basically destroying the country as it can if it's done in the wrong way, essentially.
Well, the people who control it now, I'm not personally too trusting of, but maybe there can be
Yes,
a change of the guard.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm pretty anti-establishment anyway, so you
Yeah.
could put it that way. Um,
So, what do you put most of your energy into? Is there what's your current project and what's the arc of it?
I I divide my time quite a bit. So my day job, I am um, working on a project connected to, as it happens, Wikipedia. I can't say any more than that.
Okay.
I'm not working on Wikipedia itself, um, but let's just say that it's connected to Wikipedia, and you'll see more about that coming out later at some point. Um, and I uh, I'm also the that's under the auspices of the Knowledge Standards Foundation, um, and keeping things running there. So the Knowledge Standards Foundation, the website is encyclosphere.org. So like encyclopedia, but it's encyclosphere
Hmm.
um, .org, and two of our main websites are encycloreader.org and encyclosearch.org. And these are both basically um, uh, databases of free encyclopedias. Um,
Is
we've
it kind
got
of like it's like it's back to that problem of creating a consensus that's more accurate by by comparing different encyclopedias, something like doing like a
it doesn't give
meta.
you tools to specifically to compare them, but it gives you access all in one place to articles from over 60
Oh
encyclopedias.
wow, okay.
Yeah, and
Didn't know there were so
that's
many.
EncycloSearch. EncycloReader has only articles from that can be shared, that are open content, as we say.
Okay.
So,
What
yeah,
is it? What is the problem that it's trying to solve, or service is trying to provide? Maybe.
basically the idea is the superset of all encyclopedias is greater than the biggest one in the set of all
Okay.
encyclopedias. So
Yeah.
basically, we can benefit by having under a single technical standard and a shared database um, all the encyclopedias rather than just one Wikipedia.
Yeah.
Actually, I mean, and we've built that, you know, that we actually have a file format called ZWI, the zipped wiki file format.
Hmm.
And it's basically just a zip file that has an individual encyclopedia article in it, along with things like images and metadata. And it's signed also, which means it's proof against future tampering by AI, for example.
Oh, interesting.
Uh, yep.
Wow. I didn't know there's 60 encyclopedias. What does that tell us about the human being? We're just like rabid, all these different trees filled with all these collections of nuts, but they're all variations on the same nut, I guess, if there's an article
Yeah,
across the
some of
top.
them are very specialized. A lot of
Oh,
them
okay.
actually.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
But there's probably 5 or 10 general encyclopedias in there. Um, and yeah, no, it tells you that there are indeed many, I wouldn't say necessarily equally valid, but reasonably valid um, uh, presentations of human knowledge. And there's a great value in
Diversification.
collecting
Yeah.
them and
Yeah.
making them so sort of continue to be available.
Yeah.
So that's our mission. And we're also doing the same thing with books. So if anyone is still listening this late in the podcast,
Ooh, it's a zip
this right
drive.
here is it's called Zwi Book. So we take the same Zwi file format. We've taken a friend of the organization um, made Zwi files out of almost 70,000 um, books from Project Gutenberg. And then I wrote some front end software for them, put them all on these flash drives, and if anybody wants to order one, here are the blanks. I actually copy them on my own machine.
Oh, fun.
And I just think it's important. We don't make a lot of money. They're like $50 a piece. I could sell them for more, um,
Hmm.
but I want to get them out there.
Yeah.
It does
How
help
long do
to.
they last? Like 10 years, 50 years?
What's
Like
that?
how long did the little
Uh,
SD cards last?
yeah, they're not SD cards, they're flash drives,
Flash
and
drives, yeah.
I hear you shouldn't count on them lasting more than 10 years.
Yeah.
So the first thing you should do if you get one of these things on it's shop.encyclosphere.org. Um, the first thing to do would be to make a local copy, you
Hmm.
know, put it in your family's archive,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
It's only going to take 128 gigs of space, you know,
That's not that
not that
bad.
much,
It's
not that much.
like a tiny little movie library would outstrip that. Where
Right.
can people find your work
Mhm.
if they just want to interact more with what you're writing about, what you're thinking about?
Sorry, LarrySanger.org. That would be sort of where all of my personal work is done. If you want to learn more about the Knowledge Standards Foundation, that would be encyclosphere.org. And those are
Hmm.
the two main ones. I I spend quite a bit of time tweeting, but I try not to. So I
Welcome to
might
the
continue
club,
to do that.
Inveterate Tweeters Anonymous.
Yeah. So I'm L Sanger on X.
Yeah.
So
I'll link all that in the description. Thank you very much for exploring these questions with
sure,
me, Larry.
sure,
You're a
no problem.
fascinating guy.
Yeah.
Really
Thank
appreciate
you.
you in the
Yep.
show. Thank you.